Given that there are so many examples of people who had sufficient faith and yet were killed, the problem of why God permitted the death of James and others should lead us to want a much bigger answer than one that is only peculiar to James's situation. Of course, there might be special reasons in the case of James, such as the fact that the willingness of original disciples to die for their testimony provided good evidence that they were not deceivers. But we still need a bigger answer. Why was Herod not struck down when he intended to kill James? Why did he not stop the deaths of other saints in the Bible and thousands of others in church history? The example of James and these others shows that God's sovereign will for his children is not always that they all be healthy and wealthy and live prosperous lives now, but that it does not answer for us the question of why he does permit it. To have a start at answering this, it bears noting that he ultimately does intend for his children to have lives of perfect health, phenomenal wealth, and untold glory in the age to come, when the Savior returns to the earth and the saints receive glorified, immortal, perfect bodies. Before that time of perfection comes, the fact that we live in a world cursed because of sin means that the lives of the saints have a peculiar opportunity to glorify their Savior through suffering, death, and poverty in this earthly life that they will not have in glory. We see something similar to this in the case of Jesus and Lazarus, where the death and resurrection of Lazarus presented a special opportunity that Jesus would be glorified. If you had asked why Herod was not divinely struck down earlier so that James's life would have been spared, something similar was said by Martha to the Savior after her brother Lazarus died. She said, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you asked." Then later Mary comes to him and she says, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Both Mary and Martha knew that Jesus was able to save Lazarus, but he did not do so. It seems that the same question might have been on both of their minds. Why did he not save Lazarus? Jesus gives us the answer. Prior to his coming to where Martha and Mary lived, he told his disciples that Lazarus was dead, but he also said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." So the reason that he let this sickness go to death was that he would be glorified, which shows that it can be possible that sickness and death actually glorify God. Someone might respond that the fact that Lazarus was raised from the dead just shows that he does want his children to have a prosperous life. But Lazarus eventually died again, just as the mortality rate even among believers is 100%. The case of Lazarus was special in that Jesus was still on earth. But even in our time between his first and second coming, sickness and death provide a special opportunity to glorify him in ways that we will not have in heaven. He permits this sickness and death not only for his own glory, but also for the ultimate joy and happiness of those whose lives he lets be afflicted by suffering and death. Sickness can be a means by which the world sees that the believer really does treasure and love him for who he is, rather than for what he gives the believer, and so it can be a means by which unbelievers are brought to know the joy of the Lord, and that joy would also increase the joy of the believer who is sick. Sickness can push an unbeliever towards recognizing that he needs God. Death can impress upon an unbeliever who still lives that his sins do indeed deserve divine punishment, and thus it can be used to bring the unbeliever to saving faith. Sickness can draw the believer closer to his Savior, so that he knows him on a deeper level that he would not have experienced without the sickness. In that regard, think of the attitude of the Apostle Paul. When the Apostle Paul prayed that his thorn in the flesh would be taken from him, the response was that the grace of Christ was sufficient for him, for the power of Christ was made perfect in weakness. Paul's response was to say, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." That is why, for his sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul valued a sickness or trouble as a means that he might know his Savior more, which Paul recognized as the very purpose of his existence and the means by which he would in the end have the most fulfilled, joyous existence possible. Taken together, the words that were given to Paul and the words about Lazarus teach one thing. God can intend our suffering for his own glory and for our joy. Sickness and death are not necessarily the result of lack of faith. They can be purposely instituted by him as a means for his glorification. It is thus presumptuous for us to say that particular cases of sickness or death are because the affected person or others lacked adequate faith for healing. We simply don't know that, and it is pastorally unhelpful to make that accusation, especially when the ones so accused are actually rich in faith. Moreover, the acceptance that one's own disease or sickness is his sovereign will often requires much more faith than saying that such disease or sickness is not his will, for one is then forced to reckon with very challenging, unanswered questions of why he would bring about the particular disease and suffering that the believer is experiencing. Trusting his goodness and his love in the darkness of those unanswered questions is a far more difficult challenge to faith than if one merely believed that the unfortunate circumstance of the sickness was something that he did not want, but that was outside his control.
Thank you for listening. Credible Faith is a global missions-minded apologetics ministry with content available in 7 different languages across 7 websites: German, Russian, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. If you would like to support the global apologetics work of Credible Faith, go to crediblefaith.org and click on the donate icon. If you would like me to give an apologetics workshop or participate in a debate at your university, or if you would like me to give a Great Commission missions conference or apologetics conference at your church, get in touch with me through the Contact Us section of the Credible Faith website. You can also submit a request through the website to get Credible Faith's monthly email. If you are a native speaker of Russian, German, Italian, French, Spanish, or Portuguese, and if you notice that an essay from the English website is not available on the Credible Faith website for your language, feel free to get in touch with me about translating the essay, and I would read through your translated material for quality control and the desire to see content from the essay made available in your language. Thank you for listening, and have a great night.